Hello, Good News TV viewers. Thank you so much for tuning into our YouTube channel and watching one of our videos. Before the program starts, we have just a couple really quick things we'd like to ask you to do. First of all, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to be notified when we release a new video. Next, be sure to click on the share button below if you'd like to share this video with your friends on social media. And finally, type any comments you have about this program in the comments section below. We hope you enjoy this Good News TV production. God bless you.
So why the rapid rise in emotional disorders, Generation Y, Z, millenniums, and boomlets? You know, we didn't quite finish the stories last night, but part of what we're going to be talking about today fuels into some age-old problems that we were talking about last night in regards to mental health, and that is this issue of magnification of self, this pride issue. And I mentioned Nebuchadnezzar. Did he have a pride issue? A significant pride issue. And he, of course, had a lot to be proudful of. He was very intelligent. He was able to make a lot of good decisions in regards to building up a nation. The one that he was the head of in regards to the section of the Chaldeans there was actually the minority group. But yet the minority group actually rose to prominence because of his wisdom and foresight and strategy and those sorts of things. And then he was quite a builder, as you know, building this beautiful city and capital of the world empire, Babylon. And the Lord gave him some reasons to have to pause and to recognize his proper role. But he ignored that. He would kind of listen to that for a little while, but then he would ignore it over time. And pretty soon, he had to go through a depression and anxiety recovery program. How long was his program? It was a 7-year program. Now, the 10-day program was not available in those days at Weimar. But what did the Lord put him on? The first thing he put him on was a plant-based diet. In fact, his problem was so severe, it required more than just the typical plant-based diet. It had to be just the raw greens. And those raw greens are filled with a lot of nutrients. We'll talk about that in a couple of days when we get to nutrition and mental health. But he was trying to help those neurotransmitters, help to build up that frontal lobe. He also put him on an exercise program. In fact, he couldn't eat unless he exercised. And he got his sleep-wake cycles balanced with this circadian rhythm. And so he was up at dawn, and he was able to get his cycles reset. And then it's also very clear, if you look at the story, that hydrotherapy was also part of Nebuchadnezzar's plan. And if you read his testimony in Daniel chapter 4, you can see that hydro was used on a regular basis on Nebuchadnezzar. And then another thing that he mentions is music therapy. He actually got music therapy. How do you think he got music therapy? Birds. That's right. He was out there where the birds are at, and they sing. Actually, Leonard Bernstein was very good at slowing down bird melodies, and those bird melodies are all classical music themes. And in fact, the interesting thing about these bird melodies is they're very much like Bach music, because Bach music, even though it has energy and thought behind it, it's written in a minor key a vast majority of the time. And every bird song, when you slow it down, is actually in a minor key. that actually brings out more thought. You know, minor doesn't mean sad necessarily. It can be played sad, but when something is played in the minor, it allows you to contemplate it better and to actually think about it. And so Nebuchadnezzar was going through all of those principles of helping his brain, but it wasn't until the cognitive behavioral therapy part. He had to have the brain set up for it first, but it was the cognitive behavioral therapy part of getting rid of his pride. Did the program work? It worked. Nebuchadnezzar became a converted man. And it's very clear he became a converted man. And he actually then became probably the greatest king, or one of the greatest kings that ever walked this earth afterwards. So if there's hope for Nebuchadnezzar, there's hope for a number of people. Well, the rapid rise in emotional disorders in Generation Y, Z, millenniums, and boomlets. What is happening here? Generation Z, by the way, Generation Y. Let me go into a couple of other generations first. Generation X is not my generation. I'm the baby boomer generation. And the baby boomers quit being born in 1964. And so that tells you, you can, if you want to figure out, you can kind of figure out, you know, maybe at least the range of how old I am. But after 1965 and on was the Generation Xers. And this is often considered the forgotten child or the forgotten generation. This was the generation who would most frequently come home to an empty house. Why was it an empty house that they were coming home from in school? Yes, both parents were working. And so they often had to entertain themselves and things of that nature. And this is the generation where truth became relative. You know, 2 + 2 might equal 4 for you, but if I think it's 5 for me. And so this is the Generation X, where truth is not really, there's no such thing necessarily as absolute truth. And then the Generation Yers are also known as the what generation? They're known as the millennial generation. Why are they known as the millennials? Because they were reaching adulthood around the year 2000 when the millennium hit. And so the millennial generation has its own different characteristics in regards to the differences in culture and times in which they were raised in. But this is the generation of the internet. This is the generation where they got much more involved in computers and things of that nature. And by the way, a recent study was done on their own admittance. What percent of millennials do you think state that they are actually addicted to their devices? Now, I'm not saying how many are addicted, how many believe that they themselves are addicted. There's 30% of them that admit that they are absolutely addicted to their devices. And then we have the Generation Zers. By the way, the Generation Yers, when was there? I think it was like 1994 or so that it went from Y to Z. It may have been after that, maybe 95. I'd have to actually look at the actual definitions again to see. I have 2 sons that are in the Generation Y generation, and I have 2 sons that are in the Generation Z generation. We have 4 children, all boys. Well, here it is. Generation Z consists of those born 95 and later. This is known as the post-millennial generation, the I generation. They also call themselves the founders, the plurals, or the homeland generation. I had to look it up to see what it is that they believe they actually founded. And they don't describe anything that they founded, but they like to call themselves the founders. So that tells us a little bit about this generation. This generation makes up 25.9% of the US population, which is the largest percentage. So this is the generation that is going to be shaping our society in not too long a time. Currently, they contribute $44 billion to the American economy. That's a huge amount for such a young group, but when you consider there's 19 trillion in the American economy, still percentage-wise it's not that high. But by 2020, they will account for 1/3 of the US population. 40% of Generation Z admit to being addicted to their devices. So there's higher amounts that admit to it. Of course, there's higher amounts that are addicted. As I mentioned, 30% of millennials admit. But Generation Z was the generation that chose Instagram over Facebook, and you can see these generational differences by the social media platforms that they utilize. Now, our thoughts and feelings, we talked about this last night. But years ago, our thoughts and feelings were previously thought to be only sequestered up here in our brains and in our skulls. But we now know that our thoughts and feelings can be skewed by external forces we're not even aware of. And that's because the brain is a monitoring system as well as a thinking system. Maybe we should say that again. The brain is a what type of system? A monitoring system. It's not just a thinking system. That means its attention is drawn toward any object that is new, intriguing, or otherwise striking. Media and communication devices, from telephones to TV sets, have always tapped into this instinct. Whether turned on or switched off, they promise an unending supply of information and experiences. By design, they grab and hold our attention in ways natural objects never could. And this is one of the amazing things. Not too far away from here is the Grand Canyon. And particularly in this generation, when they get out of their cars, they're just stuck into their devices, still looking at their devices despite this beautiful Grand Canyon. And the only time they seem to be interested in looking at the Grand Canyon is when they can get a picture of themselves and then post it up to Instagram right away, and then they're through. They're back into the car, and they're on their way. And it used to be something where we'd want to spend a lot of time and awe and contemplation over this sort of thing. But because of this device that they have in their hand, it's actually more gripping to them than even some of the most beautiful scenery you can see on planet Earth and the most awe-inspiring scenery. But out of all media devices, the smartphone stands out. Because the phone is packed with so many forms of information and so many useful and entertaining functions, it acts as what Dr. Ward calls a supernormal stimulus. Now, we're going to be talking about this later on this week, but in the psychological world, this is a kind of a new phrase that's developed because supernormal stimuli do things to the brain that can be quite unhealthy. This supernormal stimulus, and by the way, what is a supernormal stimulus? One of the aspects of a supernormal stimulus is one that can hijack attention whenever it is part of our surroundings, which, when regards to smartphones, they virtually always are. Imagine combining a mailbox, a newspaper, a TV, a radio, a photo album, a public library, and a boisterous party attended by everyone you know. Then compressing them all into a single small radiant object. This is what a smartphone represents to us, and it's no wonder we can't take our minds off it. In a 2015 Gallup poll survey, more than half of iPhone owners said that they couldn't imagine life without the device. And when did smartphones come about? Anyone know the year? There was no smartphone until 2007. So within 8 years, we had many individuals that couldn't imagine life without the device. It's hard to imagine another product that has provided so many useful functions in such a handy form. But while our phones offer convenience and diversion, they also breed anxiety. Their extraordinary usefulness gives them an unprecedented hold on our attention and a vast influence over our thinking and behavior. What happens to our minds when we allow a single tool such dominion over our perception and cognition? Studies show as the brain grows dependent on technology, what weakens? The intellect weakens. Now, this is something that hasn't been intuitive. When these devices started coming out, iPads and these nice, convenient computer screens, educators around the world were saying, we need to have no child left behind. Everybody needs these devices. We need to have everybody learning from these devices. They're so helpful, and this is going to really help our students become far better in education and intelligence than anything that we've ever had a chance to do. And so this is going to be a superior, enlightened generation. But those assumptions were being made without any studies being done. Using a smartphone or even hearing one ring or vibrate produces distractions that makes it harder to concentrate on a difficult problem or job. The division of what? The division of attention impedes reasoning and performance. When people's phones beep or buzz while they're in the middle of a challenging task, their focus wavers, their work gets sloppier, whether they check the phone or even if they don't check the phone. When people hear their phone ring but are unable to answer it, their blood pressure spikes, their pulse quickens, and their problem-solving skills do what? Decline. Study was done at University of California, San Diego, not too far away from here. 520 undergraduate students were given 2 standard tests of intellectual acuity. One test gauged available cognitive capacity, which is a measure of how fully a person's mind can focus on a particular task. And by the way, what you're going to find out is focused attention is at an all-time low in humanity. And it has to do with this, of what we're talking about here tonight, or this morning. But a person's focus on a particular task is being measured here. The second assess fluid intelligence, a person's ability to interpret and solve an unfamiliar problem. Sometimes we call fluid intelligence IQ. The only variable in the experiment was the location of the subject's smartphones. Some of the students were asked to place their phones in front of them on their desks. Others were told to stow their phones in their pockets or handbags, out of sight. Still others were required to leave their phones in a different room altogether. The results were striking. In both tests, the subjects whose phones were in view posted the worst scores, while those who left their phones in a different room did the best. The students who kept their phones in their pockets or bags came out in the middle, and as the phone's proximity increased, brain power decreased significantly in regards to attention as well as intelligence. Now, these students were interviewed afterwards, and nearly all the participants said that their phones had not been a distraction whatsoever. They said that they hadn't even thought about the devices during the experiment. So they said the phones could not have anything to do with the fact that our scores are the way they are. They remained oblivious even as the phones disrupted their focus and thinking. A second experiment conducted by the researchers produced similar results, while also revealing that the more heavily students relied on their phones in their everyday lives, the greater the cognitive penalty they suffered. So in other words, their IQ, their attention, and those type of things began to decline considerably. Our attachment to our phones has grown so intense that their mere presence has been shown to diminish intelligence in large controlled studies. Dr. Ward, one of the researchers that's been studying this now for a couple of years, and his colleagues wrote that the integration of smartphones into daily life appears to cause a brain drain that can diminish such vital mental skills as learning, logical reasoning, abstract thought, problem solving, and creativity. By the way, let me just give you, to help us see some perspective here. Could you imagine a drug that was released by a pharmaceutical company that promised to do some positive things for the brain, but then we found out that it actually did those type of things? What would happen to that pharmaceutical company if they had not done studies and told us about that ahead of time? they would be wiped off the planet. CNN would have them at top news, and NBC, and this greedy pharmaceutical company that's putting out these things that were supposed to be helping students, but this is what actually happens. Their learning goes down, their logical reasoning goes down, their abstract thought goes down, their problem solving, their creativity. But when we find this in relation to smartphones, and by the way, there were no studies done, in a way we have released a massive drug on society without ever going through the studies and experiments to see what would happen as a result of this drug. People who had their phones in view, albeit turned off during 2 demanding tests of attention and cognition, made significantly more errors than did a control group whose phones remained out of sight. The 2 groups performed about the same on a set of easier tests. So if it's very easy questions, it doesn't seem to make a difference. But if it's something you have to think about, it makes a big difference. Different group of researchers examined how smartphones affected learning in a lecture class with 160 students at the University of Arkansas at Monticello. They found that students who didn't bring their phones to the classroom scored a full letter grade higher on a test of the material presented than those who brought their phones. That's an amazing difference. It didn't matter whether the students who had their phones used them or not. All of them scored equally poorly just by having them. A study of 91 secondary schools in the UK, published in the journal Labor Economics, found that when schools ban smartphones, students' examination scores do what? Go up substantially, with the weakest students benefiting the most. Using devices normally significantly reduces your brain's capacity to process information. According to a study from the University of London, multitasking, which is what people do when they're on smartphones to a large degree, actually reduces your IQ, with multitasking men dropping an average of 15 points, effectively giving them the same cognitive capabilities as an 8-year-old child. So we wonder why some adult men act like 8-year-old children? That can certainly be an answer right there. But one of the concerns is that these changes can go beyond just temporary. Researchers at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom compared the amount of time people spent on multiple devices, such as texting, while watching TV, to MRI scans of their brains. They found that these device users had less brain density in the anterior cingulate cortex. That's an area in the frontal lobe of the brain, a region responsible for what? Empathy, as well as cognitive and what else? Emotional control. So we have a generation of young people who have less ability to manage their emotions. They have less cognitive ability. In other words, in fact, you're going to see evidence that they're the most gullible generation. If you present a few things, even in a biased manner, you can easily manipulate this generation into believing all sorts of nonsense. And they'll firmly believe it for a while until they, get to another stage, and you'll see this sort of thing. But one of the most concerning things is that the empathy factor goes down considerably. And so their ability to even relate to their parents and grandparents in a healthy manner goes down considerably. In a study conducted at the University of Essex in the UK, 142 participants were divided into pairs and asked to converse in private for 10 minutes. Half talked with a phone in their room, while half had no phone present. The subjects were then given tests of affinity, trust, and empathy. The mere presence of mobile phones inhibited the development of what? Interpersonal closeness and trust. Diminished the extent to which individuals felt empathy and understanding from their partners. And the downsides were strongest when a personally meaningful topic was being discussed. So you'd like to present and actually have personally meaningful topics presented to family and your loved ones and to converse on those things, but the mere presence of a phone in the room blocked that ability to have that interpersonal closeness and trust and be able to have that empathy aspect of things. There are 6 current generations alive today, Each successive generation believes they're more digitally savvy, and the evidence is that they're accurate about that. But each successive generation has also been demonstrated to have less focus and lower attention spans. Each successive generation has less ability to manage their emotions. You know, I must say, I've kind of imagined what life would have been like. Just a few days ago, we had the 75th anniversary of D-Day, where the largest amphibious invasion took place there in France. And I was listening to National Public Radio last week, interviewing some of those boys who were there who had never returned to Normandy, but they were bringing them back, 75 years later for this. And when you listen to these men talk, when you listen to them go through with things, and this one of them that they were interviewing, he was doing a journal every day while he was there as part of the war. And his last journal entry was 7:15 a.m., and all he put is, "Invasion started." And then there was no journal entries for 6 days because of the blood and chaos and all of the aspects of war and the takeover and all of that before he had time to write another journal again. But the type of bravery, the focus, the coordinated effort, all of those sorts of things that went into that, endangering their own lives so that the world could remain free. Could you imagine what would have happened if Hitler actually had been successful in all of this? In fact, I dare say that none of us would be in a camp meeting like this today had that taken place. But what would happen if a generation now had to have that type of focus? Do you think they'd actually be willing to have their lives be at stake in order for a nation or a group of people to go free? There would have been a lot of conflicting aspects in regards to having to run this group. But in this case, there was unity of purpose, and all of those type of things. And that's just one of many examples of how life would have been far different had those devices been invented back in 1917 or 1907 versus today, because some of those same things would have happened. And just to give you an example of how much this has taken off, I told you last night 60%. But let me give you some other statistics. You can find these. There's an organization every 7 years that does a study on self-mutilation. And in 1993, 1% of females under the age of 25 would self-mutilate. What's self-mutilation? This is like cutting. This is doing things that are mutilating their body. They might be burning themselves. We had all sorts of self-mutilation. And in every one of our programs, we have self-mutilators that come to our program. That's a whole other topic on how we deal with them. But I can tell you one of the first ways we deal with them. I'll just tell you the first lecture that I give is a lecture very similar to the one you're hearing, because they need to get rid of their devices. But anyways, 1993, 1%. 2000, 2%. 2007, 4%. 2014, if it's exponential, what would be the next reading? It would be 8%. It seems like it's going up exponentially, 25.6%. And that was 2014. It's significantly higher today. But this cutting and self-mutilation largely takes place in a personal space where nobody is watching, but there are devices that are present. And there are things going on in regards to maybe posting pictures, and they expected likes, but then they got these dislikes and these different comments, and they didn't know how to handle the emotional aspect. Much of the emotion of the younger generation has to do with how many likes or dislikes they get after they post a picture of themselves on Instagram, and their lives are all encircled in these devices. And then they don't know the emotional pain that comes forward when you can't manage your emotions. How they deal with that is they have to inflict physical pain on themselves to such a degree to divert their mind from the emotional pain that they're not able to handle. And so that is a way of self-medicating for the emotional discord that is going on in their life, and then it turns out to become an addiction and something that they tend to do over and over again. Do these devices actually affect our memories? People's knowledge and understanding may actually dwindle as gadgets grant them easier access to online data stores. Memory experts had a group of volunteers read 40 brief factual statements. Half the people were told that the machine would save what they typed, half were told that the statements would be immediately erased. So they were taking notes. By the way, this is another study that I'll talk about right now and then go back to this study. Which do you think you're more likely to remember something, if you write it down or if you type it in? Writing it down by far. That three-dimensional aspect where you're utilizing the pressure and you're writing things down. You know, as a result of these studies, when I'm in medical meetings, I don't type notes for continuing education. I write them down, and then if I want to save them, I'll take a picture of them so I can go back to them later. But that's a far better way to be able to learn, is to actually be able to write something down. By the way, this is another woeful aspect of the younger generation. But in most of these schools, there's no handwriting class anymore. Many of these kids actually don't know how to write. They know how to type, but their teachers think they don't have to write anymore. They just need to type. But in reality, there are times when it's very useful to be able to write down notes and things of that nature and not necessarily have to type them in. And so many of the younger generation doesn't even know the process of being able to write notes down. I can tell you in our program, of course, the primary participant in our program is someone who are in their teens or 20s. Since depression has peaked, you know, prior, when I grew up, the older you got, the more depressed you were likely to get. It's still true, depression is much higher in the older generation than it used to be a generation ago due to some of these same factors. But now we have this tremendous peak in depression occurring between the ages of 10 and 30. And so that's the primary group that come to Weimar Institute for the depression and anxiety. We do have those that are older as well, but we do have a lot of younger individuals in this group. And when we talk to them about taking notes, because we want them to retain what they're hearing, they'll often say, I can't do that because if I write a note down, I'm going to miss something that I'm hearing, and I'm not going to hardly be able to catch on to anything here if I'm writing down notes. Well, of course, it takes some time to be able to do that, but eventually you can get to the place where you're writing and concentrating and barely keeping a little bit behind, but it's still there and you're retaining very well, but it's something that requires some practice. But I have had to tell them, if you only retain a third of this lecture, it's going to be better than just listening, because you're going to retain a lot less than that, although you think you might be getting more at the time. And so writing it down is important. But in this group, they were all typing them in. And they were typing in 40 brief factual statements. Half the people were told that the machine would save what they typed. Half were told the statements would be immediately erased. Afterward, the researchers asked the subjects to write down as many of the statements as they could remember. Those who believed that the facts had been recorded in the computer demonstrated much weaker recall than those who assumed the facts would not be stored. Anticipating that information would be readily available in digital form seemed to reduce the mental effort that people made to remember it. The researchers dubbed this phenomena the what? The Google effect. Because search engines are continually available to us, we may often be in a state of not feeling we need to encode the information internally. When we need it, what will we do? We will look it up. But the art of remembering is the art of thinking. This is something that's very crucial, and this is why it's important in our young people to be able to remember things that are true and factual, because it will help them to be able to think. And they'll be able, when other information comes, they know this is true, and so they're comparing it with that, and if it doesn't coincide, they're not going to be gullible and believe that, because the art of remembering is the art of thinking. And by the way, we utilize this in Weimar Institute I think, quite well. Our students do very well on the MCAT examination. And for those of you that are familiar with those who've tried to get into medical school, they have to take all of the hard sciences. And after those hard sciences, there's an IQ test that's given based on those hard sciences. And there's new problems that are presented that they've never seen before. They're actually trying to see how they can problem solve once they know the hard sciences well. And so students get often frustrated in the MCAT because I had problems presented to me that I've never seen before. I was never prepared for that. Actually, they would have been prepared if they had learned the science well enough to be able to now use their thinking to be able to see how they would problem solve that whole aspect of things. But in our courses at WEMA, of course, we not only believe in science firmly, but we also believe in the author of science firmly. And by the way, this big argument that occurs in secular campuses, science versus religion, it's almost a joke to me because there would be no science without religion. And often they don't realize that. I was speaking to a big university, a secular university in Tübingen, and I mentioned this. I said, in the American Medical Association, I actually quoted them, the first prospective epidemiological trial ever recorded in human history was from Daniel chapter 1. Daniel was the one who came up with the scientific method in doing an intervention and looking at a control group and all of that. And never in recorded history had that been done before. So science actually comes from the Bible. And this is why Newton actually wrote more about Daniel than he did about physics. And then if we look at religion in regards to what it can do with health, you can actually study that scientifically. And it actually shows some significant benefits in health in a number of different ways and those sorts of things. And so this whole argument of science versus religion is a false question. And of course, the world likes to pose these false questions and pit things against each other this way. But what our chemistry teacher does, and a lot of the MCAT is based on chemistry. You have to have general chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry. All of those are being tested in your MCAT examination. When she goes through a chemical principle, she will actually give a biblical principle that parallels the chemical principle. Now, when she does that, you would think, wait a minute, that's too much. Why don't you just stick to the chemistry here? You're now giving them something else, and there's only so much time to be able to learn this. But our students, when they take the MCAT examination, they will see a problem they've never seen before in their life. And when they look at it, the first thing they actually recall is the biblical principle. Then they remember the chemical principle, and then they're able to solve the equation. And it's because the art of remembering is the art of thinking. It's actually easier to remember two things that you associate than one thing that's isolated. And so this is one of the advantages of being able to learn without the devices, because with devices, we're not thinking we have to remember anything. And so there's nothing really stocked in these brains that are factual and true that they can relate to. And they're kind of isolated facts, easy come, easy go. And as a result, the art of thinking is at an all-time low. That's why we wrote our book called The Lost Art of Thinking. You can find it over there in the ABC. By the way, the ABC asked for a lot of our materials, so please go to the ABC and look at all those materials. But The Lost Art of Thinking is actually a textbook that we utilize for every freshman at Weimar Institute. They have to take a course called Optimize Your Brain, and we want them to become thinkers, not just mere reflectors of other people's thoughts. That's what's going to help solidify them in regards to true success. Only by encoding information in our biological memory can we weave the rich intellectual associations that form the essence of personal knowledge and give rise to critical and conceptual thinking. No matter how much information swirls around us, the less well-stocked our memory, the less we have to think with. Those are not my words, those are the words of the ones doing this research. And studies have also shown when people call up information through their devices, they often end up suffering from what's called delusions of intelligence. The advent of the information age seems to have created a generation of people who feel they know more than ever before, the scholars concluded, even though they may know even less about the world around them. This insight sheds light on our society's current gullibility crisis, in which people are all too quick to credit lies and half-truths spread through social media or news outlets. If media and devices have sapped your powers of discernment, you'll believe anything you are told by them. One study, it's the largest study of its kind, it's called Monitoring the Future. It's a major survey looking at the lives of how many young people? 1 million young people. This is a large undertaking, and one that's, there's a lot of studies coming out of this now. But studies have shown teens who spend large amount of time glued to phones and computer screens are markedly less happy than those who prefer real-world activities and interactions. Using social media, texting, video chatting, multi-platform video games, all associated with what? Less happiness. Now, of course, this isn't intuitive. They get involved because they think this is going to bring them more happiness. And on the surface, they kind of think that it is actually bringing a whole new phase of happiness to them. But in reality, when we actually look at the longitudinal studies, it is precisely the opposite. Gene Twenge says, although observational studies cannot prove causation, several other studies have shown that more social media use leads to unhappiness. By the way, we've broken this down to try to find out why that's the case. And the big attraction to social media is connectivity. But studies show the more you're on social media, the less you connect and the more you compare. And the Bible tells us comparing ourselves among ourselves is not wise. And so you have all of this comparison going on. And then you have a lot of false things that come out of this comparison. You know, a little over a year ago, to give you an example of the false things that come out of this comparison, I was at a place where I was getting some very healthy dopamine levels. You know, and a lot of people wonder, how do people like me get their dopamine highs? Because it seems like I'm doing things that are not producing these dopamine rushes, but in reality, that's a whole nother lecture. I have dopamine levels that are far above neutral, vast majority of the time, than anyone else who does using these devices or watching movies or doing all of this other sort of thing where you get these dopamine highs and lows, and you're getting a lot of time below neutral. And then the more you do these things, the more you don't spike up above neutral, you just come to neutral. So you're doing these things to feel numb, but in between times it's a deep, distressing sense of deprivation. But anyways, I was here in New Zealand in one of the most beautiful sections of the world I've been in. It's South New Zealand, the South Island, and it's called Milford Sound. And it's a fjord area that comes in from the ocean. And there's 5,000-foot peaks in a rainforest, and there are waterfalls, tremendous waterfalls, coming down into the smooth fjord water. And at the same time, we're out there in a boat, and dolphins are jumping in front of us. And it's just this beautiful experience I'm having here in South New Zealand with the people who had brought us over there to New Zealand to speak. But there were two individuals that were threatening my dopamine high that day. They were in the front of the boat, and they were arguing vehemently with each other. And I'm thinking, you know, here we are out in nature, in public, and all of this, and they're really, it's getting loud, and it's getting, you know, irritating. And then as we got close to a waterfall and the boat came by, they stopped their arguing, and they actually put up their device, and they put their arm around each other and smiled really big. And within a few seconds, that was uploaded to all of their friends on Instagram. But as soon as they got through with that, they went back to arguing again. And I'm thinking, you know what? Their friends are all jealous, saying, here I am working and slaving away, and they're having this great time. But they didn't see what happened before that picture was taken, and they didn't see what happened afterwards, and they wouldn't have been a bit jealous. In fact, they would have been very disgusted in regards to here they are, and what are they doing spending their time that way? But this is what social media does. People present themselves as what they want others to see about them, but it's often a very false, distorted world, but yet the individual looking at it doesn't recognize that that's the case. And this is why more social media use leads to unhappiness. Unhappiness, however, does not lead to more social media use. So it's the screens that actually present the lack of happiness. Youth who invested more time in non-screen activities, playing sports, reading newspapers, face-to-face social interaction, were significantly happier individuals. Life satisfaction, self-worth, happiness of young people in the U.S. plummeted in what year? 2012, the year when the proportion of Americans owning a smartphone rose by over 50%. And by the way, this same pattern is there. What did Kenya talk about on day 2 when I was there? It was smartphones, and they have more than 50% they have 70% of Kenyans now own a smartphone. And their depression rates and unhappiness rates are going down, paralleling exactly ours as a result of this. The happiest teenagers were those who used digital media less than what? An hour a day. After a daily hour of screen time, levels of unhappiness rose steadily. Now, what happens when you're using it less than an hour a day is you're not going through all of this surfing type of stuff. In fact, this is one of the things we've noticed in schools. We thought it'd be great for schools, have them do their homework online. Studies show when a student goes to do their homework online, within 3 minutes, they're no longer doing their homework. What happened? A news flash came in. Donald Trump said something about another woman, and they have to check it out. Or their friend chatted them, or sent a Snapchat where they had to look at it really quick and before the image went away. And so they're being continually distracted, and they're not able to really complete their homework. But those who are very disciplined, they will get online to do ahead of time what they set out to do, and they're not going to get distracted. And as soon as they're through, they are done, and they're laying it aside. And that's the difference between this group, and those groups will be far more happy. By far, the largest change in teens' lives between 2012 and 2016 was the increase in the amount of time they spent on digital media, subsequent decline in in-person social activities and sleep. The advent of the smartphone, the increased use of other screens is the most plausible explanation for the sudden decrease in teens' psychological well-being. And even things like playing tennis. You know, when I told you in 2008, when I made the decision to go to Weimar, we were at Weimar at the end of 2008, and there are some tennis courts about 10 minutes away from us. And our boys and myself, we like to play tennis, and with other people as well. And when we'd get there in 2008, we would have to wait for a court, vast majority of the time. You go there now, you never have to wait for a tennis court. I mean, the courts are all open. There's hardly anybody playing. Now, does that mean the population has gone down in that area? No, the population has actually gone up, but instead, they're playing things on their devices and they're doing things like that. It's not real life interaction, and the psychological well-being goes down significantly. So the key to digital media use and happiness is limited use and intelligent use, and then controlling your usage. And the lead author says, aim to spend no more than 2 hours a day on digital media. Try to increase the amount of time you spend seeing friends face-to-face, physically exercise. Those are 2 activities reliably linked to greater happiness. And then we could go into sleep deprivation that results from these devices. Sleep is at an all-time low in our young people because of these devices. We could also go into if you're using it more than 5 hours a day, all of the problems that come into that. And by the way, the typical teen is using it at least 5 hours a day on these devices. And then mental illness. We've seen autism, bipolar disorder, psychosis, problematic child behavior increase, and then digital dementia. The memories of our kids are at an all-time low. And there are books, there are studies done on digital dementia, and the more high-speed media content, the less your focus and concentration, and this will actually be due to the brain pruning neuronal tracts of the frontal cortex, which is the area that we need for focused attention. And children who can't pay attention can't learn. We have to be able to pay attention to learn. And of course, it's not just our young people. Parents often lead the way in this. And when parents attach more and more to technology, who are they detaching from? They're detaching from their children, and their children also turn to technology even to a greater amount than they do. And the absence of parental attachment does result in children utilizing these devices far greater. So all of this is concerning. We now have the highest rates of mental illness ever in America, lowest scores ever in emotional intelligence, although this generation thinks they're the most informed generation and have the greatest pride in their own abilities. The evidence is that they're least informed, the most gullible, but we cannot give them up as just doomed. There's an adolescent and child psychiatrist in Los Angeles. Her name is Victoria Dunkley. She's written a book on this called Reset Your Child's Brain: End Meltdowns, Raise Grades, Boost Social Skills by Reversing the Effects of Electronic Screen Time. And she makes it clear she will not diagnose any mental illness in any young person until they have given up screens completely for 6 weeks. She says often the brains will completely normalize, and they actually don't have autism, they don't have bipolar disorder, they don't have attention deficit. Now, there are those that truly do have those things, but often they have been misdiagnosed as a result of these devices. So the first half of her book goes into the evidence for that, and the second half of the book shows you how you can live your life device-free. And go to school device-free. You know, you can get a doctor's note, and the teacher will have to say, no, there has to be an alternate way. They're not getting on their screen to do their homework. They're not getting on their screen in order to find this or that. What are the alternate ways of doing that? And the teachers have to comply with these alternate ways in order to be able to help this child recover from their mental health condition. So one of the things we want to do, and again, this isn't just children. I'll just tell you, in the last year, I had a man who was very resistant. After this lecture that I give on the first lecture of our residential program, we give them a couple hours to tell their friends goodbye and to tell them they're not going to have their phones for 10 days. They actually do have them about a half hour a day. We allow them to have it if they don't have a strong addictive relationship to it. If they do, we might actually recommend that they go that entire 6 weeks. But I can tell you, our young people, they'll say, I'd rather not eat for 10 days than give up my phone. You know, really? I mean, this is me here, you know? It's like, you know, they're attached to their devices and all of those things. But it's not just the young people. We had one older man, and everyone, it seems, that knows about this ahead of time tries to find a way that they're going to be the one to get by the system. And so he had brought 2 devices with him. And so when everyone was putting his devices in, he put them in. But we realized that he did not put in his second device. And he was showing pictures of his grandkids to somebody else earlier on that second device. It was seen, and we knew we didn't have that. And so, and the girls are saying, we don't have this device from this older man. And by the way, he was sent there by his wife. His wife was very upset at him with all of the emotional problems that he had, although he did make money and things like that. And so, you know, he had these pro-con lists of being married to this man, but he said, I am not here on my own volition. This was my wife's demand that if we're going to stay married, I had to come through this program. But he was still utilizing his device. And then when I had the meeting with him, and they said, Dr. Nedley, you're going to have to address him. I says, you know, you haven't given up your devices. And he says, yes, I have. I put it in there. I says, you have another one, sir. Before I said that, though, I asked him what he thought of this lecture. And he says, it was a great lecture. I need to know, all my kids and grandkids know that. That lecture needs to go everywhere. And I says, so what about you? Do you think it would apply to you? And he says, well, yeah, I think it applies to everybody. So then I went into the next phrase and those sorts of things. And he was holding on this device, and he said, I've got my stocks, and I've got to check on those every day. Now, that, of course, it's something we had to address. He did have to give up his device. His stocks did not crash as a result of him not checking in on them that week. But we have to use it intelligently. And that means to remove ourselves from digital devices except at certain times when we need those in order to gather information, and then stop that entire process. And so the circuitry for paying attention is identical for the circuits for managing distressing emotions. And one of the keys is a digital Sabbath every day, sometime when kids or adults aren't being distracted by devices at all and are engaged in focused, non-device activity. And I can tell you the studies of before and after are just absolutely amazing in regards to what happens to mental health when we give up these devices. By the way, I hope we have a business entrepreneur here today. There was someone here, not here, but in another place, that heard me give a talk over on the East Coast, and they actually formed a company to create dumb phones. What's a dumb phone? This is where you can still utilize your phone. You can still text if you need to, but it doesn't have any of the screens or smartphone activities. And it's far less expensive. It's far, easier to operate. You can still be in connection with the world. And they believed in it so much, they created 120,000 of these dumb phones, and they were sold out within 2 days. Because the world is catching up that we need to change. This information is going a lot of places. So if there's an entrepreneur here who has a phone company or whatever, I would encourage you to do that. And I might even be willing to team up with you. One of my associates says, Dr. Nedley, you need to create the Nedley phone and have this phone that's not going to be all of this distracting elements. But there are ways around this system. And is it worth making a change? I can tell you it is worth making it. The before and after difference of humanity who makes this change says how everything in their life gets better by getting rid of this super normal stimulus. Any questions or comments about what I've presented thus far? Yes.
Dr. Nedley, why are all the kids, they're all diagnosed anymore with the ADHD? And, my generation, when I was in school, you might have had the funny kid, but not all these kids. I have 3 grandkids. They say they're ADHD. And every time you turn around, that's the excuse for the kid that's hyperactivity. I don't understand. Do you have anything?
Okay, ADHD, just briefly, and this will be the last one because I know there's another seminar coming up. ADHD is diagnosed when a person meets a group of criteria, which includes their driven to distraction aspects of things. But it is not a primary mental health diagnosis. Whenever someone presents with ADHD, I'm trying to find out why is it that they have ADHD? What are the things underneath it? And yeah, there may be some biochemical tendencies that way. There may be some genetic tendencies that way, but that's never enough. There has to be other pieces. Usually there's 4 different factors bringing about ADHD. And once we can find out those 4 factors, we can begin to reverse that and be able to make a tremendous difference. I know genetically and biochemically, my second son has aspects of driven to distraction. I mentioned how we would play sports. He could do tennis okay, but baseball, no way. You have to be out there in right field and be ready for that ball when it comes, and it may not come for 5 minutes. He's looking around. He's, looking everywhere. This is a boring game. No way that he's doing this or that because of the ADHD tendencies that are there. But when he was in the right academic setting that could help bring about that focus, what a difference it was made. And when he was in 8th grade, his teacher says, this guy's going to have to be he'll have to be a janitor or something like that. He doesn't really have those type of abilities. And last year he graduated from medical school, and he got the most difficult residency to get into in orthopedic surgery. But that is something that required him to have a lot of focus and attention on, but we were able to work around that through nutritional and biochemical factors to help get rid of that entire ADHD diagnosis. Now, could it come back again? Absolutely. If he quits exercising, if he quits doing some of these things, if he gets into his phone and in ways that we just talked about, it's all going to come back, and he's going to have problems even as an orthopedic surgeon. So he has to pay attention to the things that are going to keep that ADHD down. Well, I hope this is helpful, and we'll look forward to seeing you tonight.